Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am allegedly the speaker this morning. I'll try to come through with that. My topic is informal social power. Gary usually picks the more difficult topics for me. I'm not quite sure why that is. Just in terms of my background, I'm an official of WASH and I am a most recently retired Sam P. Dell Research Scholar and Professor at the University of Florida. And my research interests, of course, are in problems of law and power, and to explore the foundation of human rights as not so much a gift from the states or the UN, but as a product of small group, micro-social human interaction, and to explore the theory and method by which you can distill the precise outcomes of small group interaction, which essentially generates norms, understandings. Some of these norms gravitate to acceptance by other groups, and as they gravitate over time, they become accepted standards. Accepted standards get flowed into legislation or into international legislation and so on. But to a large extent, I suspect that we owe our International Bill of Rights to beginnings in small group communication, collaboration, and interaction. So I suppose that's why you probably asked me to talk to this. For those interested in this area, I have an article in the Virginia Journal of International Law, and it's called Communications Theory and Human Rights, the Foundations of Human Rights in an anthropomorphic sense. So for what it's worth, that's what it is. The intellectual inspiration of my comments today comes from two senior fellows of the Academy, now passed on, who were great theorists of international relations, international law, and social process. So I am really applying some of these ideas. Right, now we start with social power. I think the first thing we have to do here is to just clarify what we mean by formal power and then get into the informal. So by formal power, what we generally mean is that power usually in the sovereign state is allocated between an executive of some sort, a parliament or congress of some sort, a judiciary and legal profession of some sort, and a form of administrative practice which we today regard as not quite the same thing as branching off from the legislative or the executive powers. And so, in a sense, when we talk about formal power, that's what we talk about. But the central point to keep in mind is that formal power does not account for all power in society. Neither is formal power static. That is to say, you can have an executive, but there's a long line of an executive that's an executive that is the epitome of patriotism, goodwill, and understanding. So there's a lot of differences. And the question would, of course, be what factors outside of the internal mechanisms of the formal system of power will influence the way in which these institutions evolve and act over time. Now, in the context of social power, I think it's fairly obvious, at least in most democracies, that the organization of social power will influence the executive, will influence the legislature, sometimes will also directly or indirectly influence the courts and the administrative system. In the context of the US in particular, it's often the case that in the administrative sector of the governance, it's where the civil society or the pressure groups or the lobbyists have the most say. Legislation can never be that precise, so it goes to the administration. The administration advertises that it's going to have some rule making. Well, the meaning of the legislation will be determined by the rules that it adopts. And those who are first in line, who write up the rules that the government should adopt, will usually be the ones that prevail in the rulemaking. So what happens then is real rulemaking is highly influenced by the specialist groups, whether they come from business, banks, administration, or whatever. And these people will spend millions and millions of dollars to write up the regulations that the administrators will adopt as the form of rulemaking that implements government policy. Now, to take this more broadly, it would be far too ambitious to look at the way in which organized groups influence government as such, or influence each other to suggest alternative ways. Maybe one of those ways would be replacing the government itself. Most recently, a senior ANC man in South Africa, for example, called for replacement of the president. He was confident that he would be able to get the support of the parliament to do so, but he was also confident that he could mobilize civil society and create so much pressure that the president would have to resign. We shall wait and see what the consequences are of that, but that's one illustration. Now, to probably get a better understanding of social power or informal power, I think the most important approach would be to look at the way in which society is organized in groups of some sort, which target the fundamental values about which society is organized. Now, there's a great deal of confusion about the question of values. Most people intuitively think that if we're talking about values, we're really talking exclusively about what ought to happen. But in fact, values are used in two different senses. They're first of all used descriptively to describe the state of social organization as it is. And to describe the state of social organization as it is, you need to know how the values are produced and actually distributed. Who gets what, when, how, and why. Right? That's descriptive. It's not ought. And so it should not scare any serious hard scientist. But there's another point to this. Once you get an ability to state what the score is, then the obvious question is, well, can we perform better? Can these values be produced in a more efficient way, in a way that's less of a threat to the environment, that's maximizes, say, the employment of people, and minimizes inequality? Can you produce values in a way that, at least from a normative point of view, makes it more efficient, makes it fairer and just? The second aspect of this is, and how are the end products of the values to be distributed? In other words, how do we shape and share values? That's a normative question. And there's a great deal of controversy about that, but I shall try to clarify that for the sake of some of our scientists here. Just for what it's worth, there are two books recently published, McDougall and Laswell, Jurisprudence for a Free Society, Studies in Law, Science and Policy, which contains many clarifications of this question. And then I have a recent book as well, Configurative Contextual Jurisprudence, the Law, Science and Policies of Human Dignity. So you find many discussions of the problem of how we justify values, the problems of separating out values from the general scientific question that you can't prove values by ordinary scientific methods. You need other methods to establish the currency of a value proposition. Now, briefly, I think that to get a hold of this informal power in the context of social dynamics, I think you can basically reduce social dynamics to 8, maybe 9 values that are commonly at play in social interaction. In other words, when people interact with each other, what are they interacting about? So the 8 that seem to me to be constant cross-culturally: power, enlightenment, wealth, well-being and health, skill, affection, respect, rectitude, and aesthetics. In other words, when we go about our ordinary business of interacting with each other, we're not looking for values. The values are already there. We may not articulate them. We may not specify them with clarity, but we are working with them all the time. They're part of the business of how we organize our human wants, needs, and desires. So there's no mystery about them if you know what to look for. They are there. But the second part of this is, once we identify the values, we are purposive, energized human beings. We want to secure some of them. We want to secure them for our needs. We want to secure them for our desires. And we maybe want to secure them for our indulgences. We want them. And so that raises the question of the nature of the social process itself. How do we secure these? Well, we secure them basically through institutions specialized in whatever degree to the realization of those particular values. So that if you were to say power, okay, I want power, then the question is, how do I get it? Well, I would have to search for and identify the appropriate institutions in society that are specialized to power relations. So I may join a political party. I may join a particular pressure group. I may join, I may participate in government, get a role in it, to express my power needs and so on. And so the question then is, power, we need institutions, we need political parties, pressure groups, government institutions. Enlightenment, well, to pursue enlightenment, well, we need universities, higher education institutions, and so on. We need WASP. Well-being and skill, well, we need hospitals, clinics, and so forth. Skill, labor unions, and the organization of labor through society. Affection, a rather complex value, and one little understood. To maximize the giving and receiving of affection, we have evolved essentially micro-social institutions. Now, you can call them different things. Some people say it's the family, but families have many different sizes and components. Or you could call them affection units, which probably is a more descriptive term. But it's in these micro-social units that human beings as children learn the basics of how to get along with each other, how to exchange emotion in constructive ways, sometimes in destructive ways for that matter. But clearly the family form is one of the most important institutions for the transmittal of love, and we know that children don't survive if they don't get some measure of love in the family. Why is affection important? Well, because if you're successful with your family form, you elevate the notion of positive sentiment. People grow up having a much more positive sense of who they are, who their families are, who their neighbors are, what their city is, what their society is, what humanity is. And so the maximization of affection at the micro-social level is as important as the maximization of positive sentiment to secure patriotism, loyalty, compassion, human rights, if you like. Affection has although it's an emotion element, but it's one of the most important foundations of civilizing human relations on the planet. And then there's respect. Social class, the foundation, if you like, of modern human rights is that you don't disparage people, you respect them. Many people say respect is the foundation of human dignity. Okay? And so the maximization of respect on a global basis is one of the surest methods of assuring a more peaceful world than a warlike world. And rectitude, well, there's a great deal of controversy about religion, and so, but generally religion has brought a keener sense of morality and ethics to human relations, sometimes abused, sometimes not. But we can see the churches, the temples, the synagogues, the mosques, and so on, are those institutions specialized to rectitude. Okay? And then I added a category called aesthetics, controversially in this field, but museums, monuments, culture, creativity, that's what the aesthetic of the culture represents, and it seems to me very difficult to imagine a working, functional, operationally relevant society that has no ethics. I just can't imagine that. So that's good. Now, this gives us just a sense, briefly, of how informal power is organized, because each of these values depends on some institutional form, and it's not necessarily governance that secures these and that advances them, or puts pressure on governance to realize them in some way or shape or form. This can be extremely complicated, and I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but when we connect this to social power, the most important thing here is that you have an ability now to radically contextualize power, to give the most radically contextualized description of power in any society and at any level. Okay? In a nutshell, this is what we do. We say that you want power. When you look for the institution that's most effective for you to get it, you go to the courts, you go to the legislature, you go to the executive or the parliament or whatever. That's the way you try to secure your power, want or need or demand. But now, what about the other values? Well, the most important thing about the other values is they are not necessarily values that you would demand, but they are values that you can use to get power. So wealth can be a base of power to get more power. Well-being could be a base of power. Enlightenment, skill, affection, rectitude, and so on could be bases of power. Certainly in the context of aesthetics, if you're skilled at propaganda, propaganda can be a critical tool to access power, to get power. Those of you who want to look at this, go look at the Nazi propaganda during the 1930s. It's amazing stuff, but it's one way in which the population could be mobilized in terms of a sense of anti-Semitism, sense of skepticism and hatred of those non-self others, etc., etc. It virtually formed the foundation of the war, the Second World War. So this is a very short, almost excessively methodological way of saying that power is multidimensional, and groups in many different levels of society, if they're aware of the institution, the objective, and the means to get there, they are certainly empowered. Now, one of the most controversial things that I experienced was I was invited to contribute to the developments of the Constitution in South Africa. And it occurred to me that the most unempowered people in that country were the poor. So I wrote my proposal, and in that I said, well, it seems to me that with almost 50% of the people in poverty, you need to empower the poor. You need to give them a voice. You need to, if you can give them the facilities so that you can transmit the knowledge of decision-making to the poor, well, that gives them a chance to understand their situation in life. They would perhaps know that for this type of thing, we need to make a decision about legal assistance, or legislative access, or how you approach the executive to secure some important need or desire. But what I found out was there was almost a revolt against this proposal. No one in the ANC or the Nationalist Party wanted to think about the idea of empowering the poor. And I thought if you empower them, that would be the best way to get them out of the status of poverty and into something more acceptable. So this particular notion of informal groups was immediately recognized by all the parties there as a threat to whatever political position they sought in the future. Now, just a few more points. We didn't talk about the problem of personality and power. And in a sense, this is relatively new. It's nothing in the 19th century. It only comes after Freud. And so one of the problems that we had in the past, we didn't have a sense of how the personality is structured. And we didn't know what about the personality would have some partiality to the framework of power relations, how to get power or how to exclude yourself from getting power. But this, what Freud showed us was that human subjectivity is crucial in human relations because it's the way in which you express yourself in terms of decision-making, in terms of adjustment to other social classes and groups, and in terms of alignments for the organization of pressure and power. And so one of the understudied issues, and still highly resisted, I think, because it runs counter to the conventional wisdom in science, was that we need an understanding of the way in which the personality organizes itself, not necessarily for therapeutic purposes of psychoanalysis, but for the purpose of a viable social science. The categories we've evolved are things like human subjectivity, really has three components based on some aspects of Freud, for example, the centrality of human identity. And no one can today question the idea that we know more about human beings because we know more about human identity. And there are many, many demands that flow from the idea of human identity. Not just citizenship, domicile, and whatever, but gender. Is a transgender person permitted to marry another? Should a gay or a lesbian be punished or even put to death because they have an orientation different to others and so on? So identity is an extremely important thing. And in some contexts where ethnicity is a factor, if you have the wrong identity, that's your death sentence. So it's a really important thing to keep in mind. Identity. Hence, any description of social process must take into account the integrity of the identity of the individual. And that has broader ramifications for social dynamics. The second aspect of this, which we owe to my friend here, is the ego. And the ego has demands. And I would submit that if human beings are not willing to assert demands for any of these values, we have a dead society. If nobody asks for anything, nothing happens. And so the ego psychology would more or less say, well, the ego would demand some measure of power, some measure of respect, some measure of affection, skill and well-being, rectitude, and so on and so on. But the lesson we got about this is that when the Soviet Union changed, one of the shocks that people had was the people in the Soviet Union were rather mute about expressing their wants, desires, or needs. They didn't ask for anything because if you did in the old regime, you could be punished for it. So it took a long time for people to get out of that self-censorship mode and actually express themselves and make themselves part of a more democratic dispensation. So we have then from the personality, we have the identification of the self, identification of one's needs and desires in terms of values, and then finally we have the restraints that the self imposes on the self. That comes from Freud's superego. But what it means is no matter what I want and what I desire, I just can't have sex with every woman on the planet. I can't have every Jaguar or Mercedes-Benz. I have to have some restraints on what I want, some reasonable, rational constraints that make me a functioning part of a broader constellation of values and interests in society. Now, when you take human subjectivity out of the equation of human relations, what have you got? It's like a man wearing a pants. Pants is well dressed and so forth, but there are no legs inside it. Nothing there, you see. So in a sense, human subjectivity has to be at this, no matter how difficult, has to be at the center of any science of society, etc., etc. Now, what's important about personality, subjectivity, is this. We know that certain types of personality gravitate to power. What types gravitate to power? Laszlo developed the notion of homo politicus, the political man. The political man or woman is the person whose personality is oriented to power, is skilled enough to acquire power, is skilled enough to use it in effect in society. Not everyone has these skills, but we generally like to think that our leadership classes tend to emerge with this kind of power. Why do they emerge with this kind of power? Well, it's an odd kind of thing, but when you are going through the phases of your personality development as a child, you almost have to experience some measure, not an excessive amount, but some measure of deprivation. It's deprivation that generates the need for gratification, but not an excessive need. And it's that need that ultimately emerges in in the formulation of the following, that the political personality represents private motives displaced on public objects and rationalized in the public interest. That is the political personality. So if you take all of those things out of the equation of social relations, organization, power, I think there's nothing there, It's what I'm saying. So the structure of personality then is critical for the study of leadership, study of political relations, and then here's the other side of it. Because personalities can sometimes emerge from families and societies with deficits, and if these types of personalities gravitate to situations of effective power, your practical problem is, what constraints do we have to limit the psychopathological personality? Now, you don't have to have an imagination to figure out that Hitler was psychopathological, Stalin was psychopathological, Mao was psychopathological, a bunch of generals in Argentina were psychopathological, and so on. In other words, many sick human beings, psychopaths, have the cunning and the skill to get into power, but God help you when they get into power. They know no restraint on what they're willing to do to stay in power and to remain in power indefinitely. So again, we can think about ways in which we can utilize values to limit these guys. Laszlo talked about preventive politics, some constraints on these guys. People like me talk about strengthening the rule of law values to restrain the extreme personality types, the personality types oriented to repression and tyranny and so forth. We can't solve all those problems, but you notice there's a world rule of law system going on. Most countries where they have an articulate legal system will usually have pressure groups concerned with making sure that the rule of law foundations of the modern state are secure. What do we mean by rule of law? We mean that the executive cannot exercise power in excess of what the law and the Constitution allocates to him, or the legislature for that matter, or anyone else in society. So, and then finally, we come to another reality which is beyond the business of social process, and that is, now we realize that you cannot have a viable social process without prefixing it with eco-social process, which relates to the problems of climate change and the survivability of the planet. And the ecosystem is also clearly implicated in the distribution of nuclear weapons and the threats to use them and so on. So those then are the main points of informal society. I just add a few more points. We have thousands of associations of non-governmental groups connected by the modern communication system and so forth. Modern communications has had enormous potentialities in organizing people nationally, globally, locally, and so forth. And therefore, communication has become an important component of this. Now, there are upsides and downsides of this. You know the upsides because Facebook and things really do facilitate exponentially human communications, which are important to the exercise of power. But what we have not really considered more carefully is the ability of special interest groups to control access to the media, to buy the media if necessary, and to flood the media with propaganda. When the Iraq war broke out, the Bush administration was stumped as to what to do because they didn't think that technically a state could declare war on a non-state actor. The national rules didn't quite clarify this. But they emerged with a very interesting idea. They said, all we've got to do is just monopolize the propaganda, put as much money into it, to say that we can do X and we can do Y and we can do... And if we flood the media, there won't be any way to rebut this. We can create our own truth. By monopolizing the media, by flooding the media relentlessly, we can create our own truth. And they tried. fortunately, we were able to block them in a number of these areas. But that idea that you can monopolize the media, flood the media relentlessly, well, what does it do? Now we have a guy that is running for the presidency of the United States. He lies every 3 minutes, and he's quite brazen about it. He just lies, and he repeats the lie again and again and again. Now, it may not be that the lie is accepted as a lie, but what it does do is it tarnishes the idea of truth. Now it's extremely difficult to get some kind of reliable sense of what really is the score, what really is the truth. And this idea of using the media relentlessly, buying up time relentlessly, really is an effort to challenge the idea that you can distill an authentic and credible scientific truth. At worst, people say, we don't know who to believe. But if you lie long enough and frequently enough, some of it sticks, and that's it. So we are faced, even with the great possibilities of the modern communications revolution, we are faced still with conflicts about the management of the media, the truth or falsity of propositions, and so on. Thank you.